with Senator Bill Bradley has been rescheduled for May 11th due to the National Day of Mourning for President Nixon. On Thursday, April 28th, Lee Brown, Director of the National Office of Drug Policy, will talk about drugs and the future of our children, a call to action. And on Monday, May 2nd, Reed Hundt, Chairman of the Federal Communications Commission, will talk about development of the information superhighway. Transcripts, audio, and videotapes of this luncheon are available by calling 1-800-500-9911. If you have any questions for our speaker, and I certainly trust that you will have many of them, please write them on the cards provided for you at your table and pass them up, and I will ask as many as time allows. I'd like now to introduce our head table guests and ask them to stand briefly when their names are called. Please withhold your applause until all the names are read. From your right is cartoonist Pat Oliphant. You weren't listening. Fred Voss, historian with the National Portrait Gallery. Ron Cuddington, senior illustrator of Knight Ridder Tribune News Service. Bill Recken, creator of the cartoon strip Croc. Hey, this is a stellar head table, I want you to know. This is probably one of the best head tables I've seen in a while. Not to mention Andy Rooney of CBS News' 60 Minutes. Robert St. John, a reporter during World War II for the Associated Press and NBC. Chris Mauldin, the wife of our speaker today. Skipping over our speaker for a moment, we have Christy Wise, a freelance journalist and chairwoman of the National Press Club Speakers Committee. Helen Kirkpatrick, famed World War II correspondent with the Chicago Daily News. Frank Holman, reporter during the Korean War for the New York Daily News, and a past president of the National Press Club, not to mention the repository of all the lore of the National Press Club. Alan Fern, director of the National Portrait Gallery. And Ed Schaefer, vice commander of the American Legion, Department of Washington, D.C. Cartoonist Art Wood. And finally, Paul Green, reporter during World War II for Stars and Stripes and a retired CBS News producer. Now let's hear it for them. I would also like to thank Bill Hickman, a member of the Speakers Committee who arranged today's luncheon, and staff members Melissa Bender, Pat Thornsberry, Melanie Abdow-Dermott, and Jeff Tarbell for organizing today's luncheon. Now, the National Portrait Gallery has honored the news business this week, or last week, by opening a new exhibit called Reporting the War, the Journalistic Coverage of World War II. This exhibition runs through the summer. I've seen it, and I commend it to you highly. There you will see the giants of World War II journalism. Ernie Pyle, the revered Scripps Howard correspondent who died in battle in the South Pacific. Edward R. Murrow, who literally created broadcast war correspondence from his reports from London. Margaret Burke White, perhaps the best-known war photographer. George Schuyler, an African-American journalist who questioned America's war ideals in the face of discrimination at home. And, of course, Helen Kirkpatrick, who is here, who joins us here at the head table, who became the star of the Chicago Daily News' war coverage. You'll see in this exhibition a huge poster that was put on the trucks, the Chicago Daily News' trucks, with her face smiling at you and commending her for her coverage of the war. Now, the man who gave us one of the most memorable views of the war is our guest today, cartoonist Bill Mauldin, who was drawing for the military newspaper Stars and Stripes. In the exhibit, you will see a huge photograph of him looking at you from more than 50 years ago. Two things struck me about that photograph. One was how young Bill Mauldin was when he was creating his Pulitzer Prize-winning and unforgettable characters, Willie and Joe, the two sad sack infantrymen sloshing the way through the mud of Europe. The second is that impish look on his face. Just one glance will tell you that this guy probably infuriated his elementary school teachers just as much as he did General George Patton. Patton was so angry by the way Mauldin portrayed officers in his cartoons that he wanted to have Stars and Stripes banned from the Third Army. That led to a face-to-face meeting between Mauldin and Patton, the sergeant and the general. As Mauldin recounts, Patton didn't convince him of anything. And, unsurprisingly, he didn't convince Patton of anything. But in a public relations battle, 3 stripes will always win over 4 stars. Mr. Mauldin's editorial cartoons brought the war to life for a generation of Americans. The Pulitzer Committee was so impressed by Mr. Mauldin's talent that he won the first of his 2 prizes when he was 23 years old. He picked up another Pulitzer in 1959 for a cartoon involving Russian author Boris Pasternak. Born on a farm in New Mexico, Mr. Mauldin sold his first cartoon at the age of 9. He never finished high school. He joined the Army instead. But he has been awarded 6 honorary degrees and doctorates and has conducted seminars at Yale. Just as he was remembered as a soldier's soldier, he is a reporter's reporter. So, ladies and gentlemen, we are delighted to have Mr. Mauldin as our speaker today, and please join me in a warm press club welcome for him.
I may look young, but I'm not very spry anymore. It's a real honor to be here. Thank you. I was last in this building, I think, about 25 years ago, before they refurbished it or redid it. I made a couple of notes. Maybe I better stick with them. Yes, there's a story to tell. It's a war story. In Sicily, in 1943, I was part of the staff of a little ragtag newspaper called the 45th Division News. It had been founded in 1941, actually no, in 1940, by Walter Harrison, who was then or had been the managing editor of the Daily Oklahoman, and it was in the Oklahoma National Guard. He was the G2 officer. He was primarily a newspaper editor, though, and he thought we should have our own. We were the first division to be called up in what Roosevelt called his limited national emergency. And in 1940, we were what they call it, federalized then.
September 16th.
Right. The Army had in it, the U.S. Army, something like 175,000 men total, most of whom seemed to be deployed in the Philippines. And we brought it up to 200,000, the division. It was an old-fashioned square division. And we were pretty square, too, I'll tell you. We didn't have any weapons to speak of. Later on, this is more than a year before Pearl Harbor. It was about, I would say, 16 months or so before Pearl Harbor. And the Japanese were not aware of it, but they could have gone right through the United States like a dose of salts. One combat team out of landed at San Diego or someplace like that, or Los Angeles, would have taken the United States without any opposition to speak of. They'd have gone through us like a wet paper bag. We were still, some of you, if you're old enough, remember the wooden gun phase of the United States Army. We had broomsticks for rifles. We had 2x4s on baby carriage wheels simulating machine guns. And for God's sakes, we had stovepipes for mortars. And that was the state of the U.S. Army, and that was the state of our defenses in those days. And then we had the 45th Division News, which was no great improvement on the. But anyway, we were a fairly independent-minded bunch. But of course, this was something I only knew about by reading the paper when it came around, because at that time I was in the Quartermaster Corps. I had joined this truck outfit in Phoenix because I was a pretty good truck driver in those days. I was 18 and I had grown up on a family farm, and we sold apples mostly. And these guys would come in with their big semis and haul away our apples by the ton for applesauce in Corpus Christi, Texas, or wherever. And my job, my father gave me, was maneuvering these big semis around in the orchard so we didn't break any limbs unnecessarily. So I was a pretty good truck driver, and I listed myself as that in my classification thing. And the trouble with that unit was, I thought I had really found a home in the Army there with this truck outfit. But the trouble with it was that I didn't get to drive a truck. I set records for KP, latrine duty, and garbage duty, mainly latrine and KP. And there was one period of 64 days of straight KP, for example. I was a lippy little devil, you know, and it was always, all they could do was just throw me back on KP for a while. In the course of all of this, I made sure that some of my drawings, of course, by this time I had been to art school. When I left high school, I went to art school in Chicago, the Academy of Fine Arts, and a misnomer if there ever was one. They had a cartoon class, and which of course I signed up for, and the teachers all agreed that mainly I needed to learn to draw. I could draw. I mean, I had always drawn, but I didn't draw very well. I'd had no training at all, except for a correspondence course, which didn't help at all. So I did agree with them that I should probably follow their formula, which was don't do any cartoons. They hardly let me do any at all during the whole year I was there. It was a 2-year course nominally, and I only had enough money for 1 year. And they said, for you, it's anatomy, 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 composition, composition, composition. And they held my feet to the fire and my nose to the grindstone and trained me. And by golly, they did a pretty fair job of it. So here I was in the Army now, a sort of semi-professional artist. And so I started doing cartoons about the life I was living as a KP and so forth. And I made sure that my stuff accidentally fell into the hands of Colonel Walter Harrison, the G2 officer. And the next thing I knew, I was summoned up to the colonel's office at division headquarters. And he said, not bad, you know. He said, would you like to work for the division newspaper? I said, yes, sir. He said, all right. He said, we'll give you a half day off every week from your regular Army duties to do a cartoon for us, and it better be good. You know, this was not quite what I had in mind. And I said, I'd rather be up here at division with a drawing board in the corner, grinding out my cartoons. And he said, what would you draw about, Mauldin? You know, he said, really, I was 18 at the time, you see. He said, what would you draw about? You don't know anything. And I said, well, I would find things to draw about, sir. And he said, it's no good, no good. You gotta stay in the Army and come up here for a half day every week. He said, take it or leave it. And I said, I'll take it. So I should say one other thing. Before I said that, I said, sir, I would rather be in the infantry This was what I had got in this truck outfit for in the first place, was to stay out of the infantry. I knew enough about the Army that I didn't want to be in the infantry. Yeah, I said I would even rather be in the infantry than to stay in that chicken outfit that I'm in now. And he said, well, we can take care of that. The next morning, the company clerk in my quartermaster company said, Mauldin, you really screwed up. I don't know who you made mad at division, but by division orders, you are transferred herewith to K Company of the 180th Infantry with the classification of a rifleman. And I stayed in that company for 3 years, actually, and it was what I really needed and what I really wanted. I just didn't know it. And also, I should add that I slowly wiggled my way even out of the infantry and back to doing more and more cartoons. So my life took a turn for the better right there. All right, so, before we went overseas, we went overseas in '43. By this time, we were probably one of the most overtrained National Guard divisions in the whole Army. And by this time also, we had real weapons and had trained with them, and we were a good division by then. Our first combat was in Sicily, and shortly after we landed there, our division brass decided that our little paper, which had a staff of 4, by the way, it had Don Robinson, a reporter from the Oklahoman, who was the editor, and it had Bill Barrett from the Cleveland Press, who is still around, by the way. I think he's retired now, but he's still alive and in Cleveland. Fred Sheehan from Throgs Neck, New York, who's now dead. Both these guys were infantrymen, and in other words, we were all on detached duty at this point. George Tapscott was a photographer from the Daily Oklahoman. He's still around. And I was the little tag-leg cartoonist who from New Mexico who made up the rest of the staff, and that was it. And we put out this little paper. When we got to Sicily, the division brass said to us, you guys are a morale factor. You're a menace to yourselves and to everybody else with weapons. And if you think you can put out the paper without any backing, without any funding at all, because there's nothing in the TO that allows for you people, and if you can get this paper out and make it a fairly regular thing of it, and you're going to have to figure out how to pay for it too. This part didn't worry us at all. we were pretty good scroungers by this time, and so we did. You know, you can put out the paper, and remember, as an incentive, if you fail to put out the paper, you go back to your units. Nobody was ever so motivated as the staff of that little paper. We landed in Sicily. The first thing we did was get out a paper in the town of Vittoria, Sicily. We put our shoulders to the flywheel and cranked this old flatbed press by hand or by our shoulder, and got out an edition. And by the time we got up to a town called Caltanissetta, right in the middle of Sicily, we were really wheeling and dealing. We were putting out a paper. And I stole a motorcycle from the chief of police of Caltanissetta. He had left it in the Opera House, and apparently a bomb had dropped on the Opera House, blown the whole dome off of it, and buried his motorcycle. I dug it out, got it running. I forgot to mention I grew up in a family of shade tree mechanics, so I knew how to do this. I got the motorcycle running. We had wheels now, and I set off for Palermo across Sicily on this little Moto Guzzi, 1-1. And we took up residence in the Opera House up there, where I'd found the motorcycle. And then a little later, I won't string this out with stories of our life with the Moto Guzzi, but we then ended up in Palermo. The British were in charge of billeting up there, the British military government, or Allied military government, and we applied to the British for quarters, office space, quarters, whatever we could get, and they gave us a whole schoolhouse in the middle of Palermo, a huge building, and we only occupied one classroom down below. We slept on the floor, and shortly after the British put us in there, they came to us and said, "We're going to have guests for you chaps." And we said, "All right, bring them in." So they did. They brought us in 50 Yugoslavs. These guys were partisans, Tito people. The Germans had captured and worked the heart out of them on the docks and were getting ready to kill them, which, you know, was standard German procedure. And the British said, "We don't know." We said, "What are we going to do with them?" And the British said, "That's entirely up to you chaps. Whatever you can do, if you can do anything to help them out, help them out." And by the way, in case this thought is going through anybody's mind, these guys were mostly Serbs. And they are tough. Well, anyway, we had a fine time with these Serbs. We really did. The first thing we did was our division brass. We had these very friendly colonels at division headquarters who supported our paper in every way, morally, that is. They couldn't support us with money. And by the way, speaking of support, I mean, the way we operated was this. At one point, when I needed I thought cartoons were necessary for this paper to survive, and for me to survive too, because somebody might ask me what I was doing. And so I drew some cartoons and set out to get them engraved on my Moto Guzzi. I found an engraver who had been bombed out, but still had his camera. And so we went off on my Moto Guzzi, and we went to an acid factory, picked up a big carboy of acid. We went to a casket maker of his acquaintance and got him to rip the lining out of a casket for our zinc. And by the way, I signed little chits for all of this stuff, little requisitions. And the name I signed on them was George S. Patton. This is known as moonlight requisitioning. Anyway, here we are with these Yugoslavs, and our friendly colonels at our division headquarters had given us requisition forms to use in ration dumps and clothing dumps and anything else, made out for 50 men. I mean 5 men. We added a 5. So now we would go in and draw rations and draw clothing for 55 men, which took care of all our Yugoslavs and us too. We drew blankets for these guys. You know, we took good care of them. We put meat on their bones. They all looked like that funny actor in Down and Out in Beverly Hills. Yeah, Nick Nolte. They all looked like Nick Nolte at his worst. They were starving, these guys, and they were tough. You know, they had that sort of combination of toughness and patheticness. Well, anyway, they were all chess players, I should add. I learned more about chess during the month or so we had those guys than I ever dreamed of learning before. And they had a very simple way of getting things that we all needed. For example, one night we decided to have a little party. they borrowed either mine or Fred Sheehan's or Bill Barrett's pistol and took off, a couple of them, and came back with armloads of wine. The local movie theater was promoting Casablanca, which had just been released. And these guys asked if we'd like to go see Casablanca. Sure we would. So they took a pistol out again and came back with a roll of tickets. These are tough cookies. Anyway, they were marvelous. We saw the good side of the Serbs. At one point, we had another of these wine-soaked celebrations, and they were toasting all the American leaders. They were toasting Roosevelt. They were toasting Eisenhower, Marshall, and you know, and everybody would leap to his feet and lift his glass and give a great cheer for these American dignitaries. And a guy got so caught up in this. I was all of maybe 20 years old and not too well versed in my geopolitics at this point. And I jumped up and raised a glass to King Peter. And these guys looked at each other and looked at me. These are all Tito men. And this is, I'm telling you this is the good side of the Serbs. They very slowly and reluctantly got to their feet and said, "It's King Peter." And it was like pulling teeth for these poor guys. And by then I realized I had really goofed up. I really had, but they were gentlemen about it. I just tell you this because I think everybody should know that the Serbs have a good side too. We haven't seen much of it lately. I read all these horror stories about what they're doing to people in Bosnia, and I say to myself, are these the guys I knew? Well, they're not. They're the sons of the guys I knew, and the grandsons too. So I don't know what to make of that, except I do know that when we finally said goodbye to them, the reason we did was that their colonel came by, a partisan colonel, one of the Tito leaders, had to collect these fellows. And he was surprised and overjoyed to find out he still had 50 men, and they were in good health. Thanks to us, they were really in good health. And he took them away on a couple of trucks. And I said, "Where are you going to take them?" And he said, "Oh, we're going to load them up on airplanes and drop them back into Yugoslavia," which I'm sure they did, and I'm sure not one of them is alive today. So maybe that's why the Serbs are such bastards in where they are now. Maybe these guys died off before their progeny could take charge. So, but maybe there must be other good Serbs. There were so many of them there, you know. And I just, every time I read another atrocity story about Bosnia, I think the world needs to know about these guys. There are good ones. There are good people everywhere. How are we doing on time?
Well, anytime you want to take some questions?
About right?
Yeah, right on.
Any questions?
Okay.
Like who won the war or whatever?
Give a...
Okay.
Yeah, we have several questions here, and we could use some more of those, so you all get writing away at your tables there. Willie and Joe, tell me how you came up with these two characters, and are they modeled after anyone you know?
Well, actually, after I was in the infantry, I decided I should have characters. This is, you know, in late 1940, we're talking still. I decided I needed characters because every good comic strip or panel has recognizable characters. And by this time, I had gotten to know the guys in K Company pretty well. This is an Oklahoma National Guard outfit. All of them, all the white men were country boys. All of them were small town or country boys, mostly from around McAllister, Oklahoma. And they were all shooters. They were all outdoor types. And then the rest of them, I would say probably even a slight majority in that company, were Choctaw Indians. Choctaw Indians, as a lot of you know, tend to be well-to-do in Oklahoma because instead of fighting the white man down to the wire, they hired some lawyers, and they own a lot of oil wells. And so this is a strange bunch of guys. An infantry rifle company, all cannon fodder, and not a single Indian in there who hadn't been to college, University of Oklahoma, most of them, a lot of degrees, a lot of serious degrees too. They were very educated, very intelligent guys, and for the only two non-high school graduates in the whole company were the first sergeant and me. So it was kind of an odd bunch. Well, in the course of the war, most of them ended up in the Air Force or in officers' candidate school or something. They moved on up in the military. They were too valuable to leave in the infantry. So, you know, as replacements, we got more white country boys. But originally, my two characters, one of them was an Indian, and that was Joe. And as I remembered, I gave him a surname, Joe Barefoot. And he was the Indian with the hook nose and the undershot jaw. And the other guy, I modeled sort of after myself. He was a round-faced character with jug ears and sort of a straight man for the Indian, who was the sardonic wit of the two. Well, in time, I began to realize these names didn't quite fit that way, and in time, I juxtaposed them. Willie became Joe, and Joe became Willie. Somehow, the hook-nosed guy looked more like a Willie. After the war, and of course, you know, there are a lot of guys who claim I drew them. Well, I did, sort of, but not any specific ones. I was at a party. I was living in Rockland County, New York, and I was at a party, and one of the guests at this party was a shrink who was looking after the host. And he was one of those shrinks. Now, I've had enough experience with shrinks since then to know that they don't usually socialize this way, but this was one who did. And he came and sat beside me on the sofa. He knew who I was, and he said, "Have you ever really studied those characters of yours?" And I said, "What do you mean? Of course I draw them." And he said, "Have you ever studied a picture of your father?" And I said, "Oh my God." And he was right. That's who Willie was. And of course, guess who the other one was? So anyway, I sort of was grateful to this fellow for this. Now I know where they came from. Okay.
About the half of the questions coming up ask the same thing. Tell us about your meeting with General Patton. This is what everybody's here for. Okay. And this questioner in particular says, what didn't General Patton like about the way you depicted officers, and what didn't you like about General Patton?
Well, I'll take the second question first. What I didn't like about him was that and by the way, I should qualify this by saying that I had really great respect for him as a general, even though he got a little rough sometimes with people. I had real respect for him. I thought he was a valuable general. I agreed with General Eisenhower about Patton's value to the Army. He tended to get the soldiers out of their foxholes. Anybody who knows American soldiers well know that they like to crawl into a hole and stay there. They have a strong instinct for survival. They're free enterprisers at heart, and how can you practice free enterprise if your brains are blown out, you see? So Patton would rout them out of their holes. If he had to kick them out, if he had to shoot them out or bayonet them out or whatever, he would get them out of their holes. This was very good. It really was, because you do not win battles by staying in your hole. And it was just simply, I did not approve of his tactics or his motives. Now we get to the other side of this. He seemed to me he was born out of this century. He was born back in the 17th century somewhere, where all enlisted men were peasants. All enlisted men were drafted by the scruff of the neck, and they didn't dare think for themselves in any way. They were there to do their officer's bidding. Well, you know, back in those days when the only people with enough education to become officers were aristocrats and employers of serfs, it made a certain amount of sense. But in Patton's world, all officers' checks were worth cashing, and no enlisted men were entitled to have checks. And it just, he was an elitist in the worst possible sense of the word. And he just was out of tune with his times. That's, there was automatic, he was automatically an enemy of mine from the time I first heard him speak and laid eyes on him. He was, I did not like the cut of his jib as a person, as a human being. And so, like a little terrier dog with my pen and brush, I sort of tended to take out after him. And we all instinctively recognize an enemy when we're dealing with one, and there was something about my stuff that just infuriated him. It wasn't just the way my soldiers looked, it was just something about their attitude. It was the way they looked back at him. And so it was a natural mutual enmity that existed between us. And the difference was, of course, he was in a position to do something about it. Well, so was I. And in the end, Three Stripes will not lose a public relations battle with 3 stars, and that was the size of it. Now, was there a question about?
Yeah, to tell the story about your meeting with General Patton.
Okay. Now, I had served in his army in Sicily. So I knew about him, and I knew about his feud with General Montgomery and how you know the two of them were conducting wars, really in a sense, in a prima donna way. They were there on the stage with armies behind them, but it was those two in combat with each other. So we knew about Montgomery and we knew about Patton. And by the way, a lot of people think I drew something about his slapping that soldier in Sicily. I was in his army in Sicily. If I had drawn something about his slapping that soldier at that time, they'd have nailed me to the wall. So I did not do that. Somebody else did that. I don't know who. But even though in the movie, which ironically enough, the Patton movie was written, I learned from General Bradley himself, that it was Kitty Bradley who'd written that screenplay and thrown in the piece about the cartoonist. And I've never yet figured out where she got that or what made her think that I was the one. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. We will move ahead to I guess it was February 1945, January or February. Toward the end of the war, and I was in Paris under rather illegal circumstances. I had driven in there. I had this Jeep, and I had driven into Paris, and I had just come up from Italy, and I was wearing the clothes I wore in Italy, a fur cap, which looked like a Russian cap. This came from the 10th Mountain Division in Italy. I had an Armored Force combat jacket, you know, those nice jackets with the knit collar and the knit sleeves. And I had a pair of paratrooper pants and a pair of jump boots. which I had gotten from the paratroopers for drawing cartoons about the wrong people wearing paratrooper boots. I had learned to scrounge back in the 45th Division days. So anyway, needless to say, I was way out of uniform in Paris. This was Courthouse Lee's territory. His MPs grabbed me just like that, you know, and they hauled me off to their little station. And I thought, well, I've done it now. I'm in trouble in Paris. I was not supposed to be in Paris anyway. I was supposed to have gone to the 7th Army in Alsace, around Strasbourg somewhere. So I thought, you know, this time I got to holler for help. I've gotten into deeper water than I can swim out of. So I called up Bob Moore, who was the editor of the Stars and Stripes in Paris. Remember, the Stars and Stripes had many different editions at that time. They had one in Rome, they had one in Paris, they had them in England, they had them here and there, something like 17 different editions. Moore, I knew, was the guy in Paris, so I called him up and explained what was going on with me and the MPs, and he said, I'll come get you out. So he came in short order and got me out. And the next thing that happened was he said, it's interesting that you should be here today, or that you should have arrived here today, because we just got a rocket from Patton today. And this rocket said, either you drop those damn cartoons or Patton's going to drop the damn paper out of the Third Army. Well, immediately, of course, the Scribe Hotel was abuzz with this, according to Moore. He said, everybody's talking about it. Everybody's wondering how Patton is going to get out of this one. Not how is Mauldin going to get out of it, but how is Patton going to get out of it? And he said he just broke that little thing about his using ex-Nazis as town officials in all these occupied German villages and hamlets. And his excuse was that, after all, they were trained civil servants. We needed trained civil servants. They knew their way around. They knew their people. And why the hell shouldn't I use them? They're just politicians. It's like, you know, they're Democrats. Nazis are like Democrats and Republicans. Well, this did not sit too well with a lot of people. So Patton, once again, had put his foot into it, and Eisenhower's problem was how to keep Patton out of the, you know, public disgrace. So I had a few cards in my hand at this point, and it ended up with a little bar session with, this again is a glimpse back into the Stars and Stripes and the way it operated. We had a circulation manager named Bill Estoff. Bill, when he was drafted in his early 40s, was asked by the classification people what his civilian occupation was, and he said bookmaker. He was a bookie in Syracuse. So they said, of course, publications. So he had been our circulation manager in Rome, and now he was our circulation manager in Paris. Well, Bill Estoff was a good friend of mine, and Bill Estoff was also a good friend of Harry Butcher, who was Eisenhower's naval aide and a very close, you know, associate of Eisenhower's. So a little group gathered consisting of Butcher and Estoff and me, and we worked out a way to solve this whole problem. Butcher said, listen, we got to get Patton out of this. He's working for Eisenhower. Butcher is. And Estoff, I'm really condensing this, took a lot of meetings and a lot of booze to get all this done. But Estoff said, you got to send Mauldin to meet Patton. Butcher said, that's brilliant. And Estoff said, what the hell, if it works, great. You know, your problem is solved. If it doesn't work, everybody will get to laughing so hard about it, they'll forget it anyway, which turned out to be the case. So anyway, Butcher got me into his office and told me that this was the plot and this was going to get everybody out of trouble and so on. And I said, that's great, except, you know, he's going to take my head off. And I'm scared of him. I was really very open about that. I was afraid to go beard the lion in his den. And Butcher said, it'll be all right. I guarantee you he won't bite you. I'll get him on the phone and show you. The next thing I know, I'm listening on an extension, and Butcher gets Patton on the phone. Patton's headquarters was in Luxembourg. And of course, Patton just came unscrewed when Butcher made this suggestion to him. Patton just blew. And when he finished squawking, he had this very high-pitched voice. And when he finished squawking, Butcher said, sir, Butcher never said that I was on the extension. He said, sir, we think it's a good idea. Well, the imperial we was unmistakable. Because, of course, Patton knew who Butcher was. He knew him very well. So Butcher said, all right, send a little son of a bitch up. I'll talk to him. Butcher said, that's not all, sir. He said, you have to greet him like a gentleman, and you have to talk to him like an equal. At least you have to meet him man to man. No rank involved, sir. Now listen, this is a Navy captain talking to a 3-star Army commander who is notorious for being tough. Patton agreed. He said, all right, send him in. I'll talk to him. Okay. So I won't go into how come I had a Jeep, but with only a few MP scrapes on the way, I got to Luxembourg, where Patton's headquarters was, and reported to Patton. Patton had one of his aides was Major Quirk, and I've never forgotten this guy's name. And I was told that Quirk was the man I should report to. I reported to Quirk, and by the way, I was told to be really spick and span, helmet, pistol, you know, washed webbing, everything clean, everything buttoned, and that's how I reported to Quirk. Quirk took me into the general's office, and there's this incredible long expanse of carpet leading to this desk. It was the old Mussolini trick, you know, make them walk a long way so they'll shrivel a little as they come up to you. And so I got up to Patton's desk and snapped a very good salute. And now it got interesting. I mean, by the way, Patton's dog Willie was on a chair right by him, and Willie took an instant dislike to me. I get along very well with dogs and cats and things like that normally, but Willie, I was immediately a threat to him. So he lifted his lip at me a little and otherwise withheld his attack. And Patton gets up and comes around his desk. And this is when I decided this is going to be all right, and offered me his hand. I mean, you know, how conciliatory can you get? He did not return the salute, which would have been a recognition of our military inequity and so on. And so anyway, it started off warmly enough for about, 30 seconds. And Patton reverted to type. He opened his drawer and brought out several clippings of my stuff. And wanted to know, for example, I had drawn a picture of a theater somewhere in occupied France or Italy or somewhere, which advertised showgirls, USO girls. Mainly it was a USO show going on in this building. And I showed a line of enlisted men of all ranks and nationalities lined up at the ticket office, and then around the corner is a line of officers heading in the stage door. And Patton said, what's the meaning of this? And I said, well, sir, it means the enlisted men buy the tickets and the officers get the girls. And he said, what the hell is wrong with that? At this point, all I could say was rather weakly, you know, well, sir, I just thought it made a funny cartoon. Well, I don't think it's very goddamn funny. And from then on, it was sort of downhill. But after he went through the cartoons, and by the way, by now we were forgetting about I was yes sir, no sir, yes sir, no sir. So much for this equal rank stuff. And oh, and by the way, the other thing was that he had said, Quirk, sit down, I want you to hear this. So Quirk did not leave me with him as had been arranged. So Quirk was there too. I'm glad there was a witness to all of this. And so anyway, we got through the cartoons, and then Patton proceeded to lecture me on what had happened to various armies around the world in the history of the world, where there had been officers had been reduced in rank to where they were, you know, equal to enlisted men. They had been stripped of their insignia and so on. And I tried to protest several times and say, sir, I am not trying to, you know, promote a democracy in place of an army. I know that you know, an army can't be a democracy, sir. Shut up. So the upshot of it was, he said, look at the Russians. They stripped their officers down to made them equal to enlisted men. And look what happened to the Russians. The Germans ate them alive for a long time until finally Stalin got smart and began to put rank back on the officers and so on. Well, you know, I wasn't in a position to argue this. And I certainly, and as I again weakly tried to say, sir, I'm not trying to impose democracy upon the Army. I know that the Army needs discipline. Shut up. But he didn't say shut up. He just sort of walked over what I was trying to say. And went on, and I was really treated to a very learned discussion of armies and their histories, and rank and its history, and the value of rank and the value of this and that and discipline and so forth. It was about a 45-minute lecture, during which I hardly got my mouth open again. And every time I started to open it, he would say something else, and I'd shut it. So it was very much of a one-sided thing, but I wouldn't call it a chewing out. I've been chewed out much more efficiently than he did by a lot of sergeants I've known. So, but he never really got out of line with this. He never really did anything I would call scandalous. He just simply, it was impossible for him to operate by Butcher's rules in this case. It was just too much for him. I mean, there was a guy who was very full of himself and full of his rank and so forth, and he's got this little snot nose to deal with, and he's just doing his best. And he did his best. The upshot of it, by the way, there is one little footnote to all this. In Butcher's memoirs, which came out, I think it was My 3 Years with Eisenhower or something like that, Butcher tells this story. And he also says that a good friend of mine named Will Lang, whom I'm sure a lot of you will remember, for Time Life, was sitting outside, and he was sort of, you might call him the pool reporter for this. I mean, the boys in the Screeb had sort of delegated Bill to cover this, or to cover my reaction when I came out of Patton's office. So there was Bill waiting for me, and he said, well, how did it go? And I said, I guess I didn't convince him of anything. And then I said he didn't convince me of anything either. And Bill reported that. It came out in Time, and Butcher said he called up Patton when this Time magazine thing came out and read it to him over the phone. Patton chuckled when you know, the first part of that quote from me. The second part, he absolutely exploded. He said, all right, that does it. If that little son of a bitch ever comes back here, I'm going to nail him. That was that.
We're almost out of time, but I want to get this question in first before we go into the closing here. Do you believe a Bill Mauldin would be allowed to function in today's armed forces of the United States? How would someone of your style function today?
I don't know. As far as I know, nobody's tried it. But I would suspect that if he handles himself carefully and recognizes that he has to pay obeisance to certain customs and so on, I would imagine somebody would get along.
And before asking the last question, I'd like to present you with a certificate of appreciation for appearing here.
Thank you.
And a National Press Club mug, which you certainly need, and like Coles to Newcastle, a book of Herb Bloch's A Cartoonist Life, signed by Mr. Bloch himself.
Well, what do you know?
I'm sure that you probably have 6 copies of that already.
No, 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 I don't. I'm glad to have it. Thank you.
And the last question is, are you the guy responsible for Kilroy? And if not, who was?
I don't know.
You don't know?
I really don't know. I don't know anybody who does know.
Explain the Kilroy thing.
Which Kilroy thing? Oh, you mean about Kilroy was here?
Yeah.
Oh, everybody knows about that. I mean, is there anybody in here who doesn't know about Kilroy? You don't know? Okay, well, it was a tradition wherever the U.S. Army went for somebody to go to I don't know, the window outside the ladies' room or anything and say, Kilroy was here on the wall, graffiti. And it was the early graffiti. Kilroy was here. Nobody ever knew who Kilroy was or what he was there for.
Thank you very much. That was excellent. Just a reminder that